Well, a warm welcome tonight to yet another talk on art in the Victorian period. And tonight we've got quite an interesting one on its interaction with the burgeoning world of scientific knowledge in the latter part of the 19th century. We touch upon a number of subjects tonight. I'm very fortunate to live in the same city as our great Museum of Natural History. I fully recommend this particular book. It's called Temple of Science, and it's a wonderful place. If you come to Oxford, I do suggest that you visit the University Museum of Natural History, and I'm indebted to them for some of the material I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. I'm also thankful for this wonderful book by John Holmes on the Pre-Raphaelites and science, and that was published by the Tate Gallery. Well, it's a Yale publication, but it was in conjunction with an exhibition at the Tate Gallery. And another book that I've lent on Heavenly is this one from Musée d'Orsay, and it's The Origins of the World, and it looks at the invention of nature in the 19th century. All of them are lavishly illustrated, and I have tried where possible to get my own photographs of for tonight, but I certainly am indebted to all of these three books, and they've helped me greatly. So we're looking tonight at an area which is, of course, huge in its scope, and I'm under these particular subjects. I'm looking at fine art and natural philosophy as really it was understood up until the mid-19th century natural philosophy. We're looking at how the Industrial Revolution obviously interacts with art and the industrialists, and obviously the harnessing of the science and engineering. We look at particularly great artists like J.M.W. Turner and his interactions with the Royal Society. We look at the enormous impact of photography, of Muybridge's work on the movement of animals and the human figure. Couldn't really speak about the University Museum without mentioning John Ruskin, who's been the subject of a number of talks in this particular series over the last 5 years. The Pre-Raphaelites, of course. We're looking at the Victorian fascination with geology and speculation about the age of the Earth. And that, of course, touches upon dinosaurs, evolution, and the great debates around Darwin's Origin of Species from 1859. We look at some of the religious reaction to that. We look at exploration. Remember, the Victorian period is one of these great periods of exploration, particularly opening up Africa and hitherto areas of the world which had not been fully mapped or understood, or indeed had been only basically not particularly well understood in terms of their geology, and also looking at certain instruments that were used to understand these particular areas. We look at the Victorian fascination in collecting and taxonomy, and lastly astronomy and medicine. This is on the right here, we have a statue, which that anyone who's been to the University Museum here in Oxford, Thomas Woolner and a number of other sculptors depict the natural philosophers and scientists which are in the central court of the museum. And this is Thomas Woolner, one of the original Pre-Raphaelites, and his statue of the natural philosopher Francis Bacon. And we shall be revisiting some of these wonderful figures that really our museum is both a celebration of art and science. And this is what tonight is really about. And what better place to deliver it from than from Oxford. So we look at the century before, and we look at really the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution as we understand it. I recently went up to the museum the Art Museum in Derby, and was looking at Joseph Wright of Derby, a very significant painter from the 18th century, with these wonderful scenes of experiments and of natural philosophy. The one on the right is the alchemist in search of the philosopher's stone, a mixture really of religious symbolism and also an understanding, a scientific understanding of the world and all of that invokes. But certainly these paintings show the beginnings of this, are at least 100 years before this area of consideration tonight. But they're wonderful paintings, and we can see resonances of these in the paintings of the Victorian era. Perhaps I should start my talk really with this painting that I've often referred to as one of the great paintings which really heralded the beginning of the Victorian era, the Great Western Railway of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, which could not have been built without a new scientific understanding of load bearing, of bridges, of the development of steam engines and locomotives that could pull long trains. And of course, too, artists reacting to this new age that was coming in. On the left here, we see the bridge, the arches of the bridge, the Bath Road, now the A4, to those of us who drive in Britain. But it is the competition that between the new world of the steam engine and the old world of the coaching inns and the carriages. But here we have the new world coming towards us in the shape of this steam engine on the Great Western Railway. This is really rather like an artist today engaging with the space program or some very contemporary subject. This is incredibly modern. Turner, unlike his counterpart John Constable, embraced the modern world, the world of science and the world of engineering, and he celebrated it in many ways. And this particular painting is a great example of that. And he also frequented the Royal Society, which had been set up in the 17th century. But there were exciting lectures at the Royal Society, which Turner attended. He was quite good friends with Michael Faraday, and particularly his experiments on electricity and magnetism were of particular interest to Turner. Turner also was very well aware of Davy's lectures at the Royal Society, and there were also at this time also Thomas Forster's work on the study of the heavens, and all of these things come into the art of Turner in some sense. So he was somebody who had a keen anticipation of the new world that was coming forward, and he was interested in astronomy. He was interested in new inventions, and the Royal Society then was in the same building as the Royal Academy at Somerset House, and so it was quite. For some artists, they met with the scientists of their day, and of course, many of the experiments as well were quite spectacular, and there was a lot of showmanship, particularly to Faraday's and Davy's lectures at this period, and they drew quite large numbers of people, not just artists, but many of the society figures of the time. And we've got to think of the Victorian age too. It was an incredible feat of engineering that by 1850 we have this Shefflin's map of the English and Scotch railways. Really, within the space of 25 years, the network, which really is mainly the network that we have today in Britain, was developed, and it is an incredible feat. And to that too, when you consider stations like the William Powell Frith's depiction of the railway station in 1862 of Paddington Railway Station at one end of the Great Western Railway, and we think also that it was also at this time that the very first underground trains of the Metropolitan Railway were developed. And here we have Baker Street Station, and it's still entirely recognisable with its vaulted ceiling. Again, a marvel of engineering. Also, it was its illumination too by these globe gas lamps initially was highly innovative and relied entirely upon many of the scientific developments, particularly in safety lamps as well, that have been developed for mining by Davy. Now, Turner, as I say, celebrated science and engineering and this new world. This can be demonstrated in these two particular paintings I have here on the screen. On the left, we have Turner's painting of the Chain Pier at Brighton, and there's a photograph of it from 1840. It no longer exists, but it was, again, an engineering marvel of its time. But as we can see, the two artists are very different in their depiction of it. In Constable's Chain Pier, painted 2 years before the Turner painting, you can see that the Chain Pier is in the background, and Constable is far more concerned with the fishermen on the beach and the clouds and the meteorological conditions than Turner is. Turner celebrates these new inventions, these new things. In a way, Constable, we know even some of his landscapes of his beloved Essex and Suffolk, turned his back upon the new railways that were being built and scientific innovations of his time. So the two artists share different views. In a way, Constable's is an elegiac view looking to a world that is fast disappearing, whereas Turner is excited by the new world and the new possibilities of the Industrial Revolution and science. And so much so that Turner also was obsessed with Goethe's colour theories, and these are illustrated in a number of his paintings, and the chromatic division of colour as well. And he went to a number of lectures at Somerset House on the application of Goethe's colour theory. Turner also produced a number of very sophisticated diagrams for his lectures on perspective at the Royal Academy. And we think of him just as a painter, but here he is as an educator as well. By all accounts, his explanations were sometimes somewhat halting, and some of the remarks about his delivery possibly class-based rather than the fact that although he wasn't an intellectual, he was certainly somebody who had a profound understanding of space and the mathematical division of space within a painting. And this is a great example of one of the diagrams for his perspective lectures at the Royal Academy at the time. And as you can see, if he hadn't had a full understanding of mathematical perspective, he could not have toured England and painted some of these wonderful depictions of English towns and cathedrals, such as the one on the bottom right corner. And we look at Michael Faraday's bar magnet experiment on the right, given at the Royal Society. And we can see from this that Turner, we can see something of this in Turner's well-known painting, Snowstorm, Steamboat Off the Harbour's Mouth from 1842. And then again, the shapes are created of the vortex of the storm are so similar to those created by the bar magnet experiment. And many have pointed out that Turner was most surely influenced by Faraday's experiments. And of course, Faraday gave tips to Turner about the chemical composition and permanence of certain paints as well. And this is something also that was developing in the early Victorian era, the moving of paints into tubes and bladders rather than to be mixed up on glass and ground down by themselves, that chemically paint was also being transformed, and there were new colours that were coming into artists' palettes, particularly the aniline dye colours, which allowed for much richer purples and reds than had previously been available to artists. But I think possibly the greatest impact of science upon the visual arts in the 19th century was certainly the photography. And it had a number of different strands coexisting. Of course, we know of Niepce in France and de Geer in France of the daguerreotype. And here in England, we had Henry Fox Talbot pioneering the calotype process at Laycock Abbey in Wiltshire. And you can go to this museum, and it's fascinating. And certainly that this photograph in the middle here from 1835 is the earliest calotype photograph, and it's just 2 years before the accession to Victoria to the throne. We shouldn't, though, we should remember, though, that artists had since the Renaissance been using methods and lenses to capture almost a photographic tonality. And so an artist like Georges de la Tour in this Repentant Magdalene from the 17th century painting undoubtedly used a camera obscura, which is a type of room with an oculus which projects the image upside down onto a canvas. We know that Caravaggio probably used something similar too. So it was only the ability to fix a photographic image upon a piece of paper or card that had really changed. But of course, it did dynamically change the visual appearance of paintings in the 19th century, and affected everybody, not least an academician, William Etty. And if we notice here, Octavius Hill's and Robert Adamson's photograph of 1844 of William Etty painting, and then we look at this self-portrait, and of course you remember you cannot paint a side view on self-portrait without some very complex mirrors. It would seem that Etty made good use of the Hill photograph in painting this particular self-portrait. And we get many such things happening in the late 1840s, and certainly by the 1850s, there is almost a competition between the artist's eye and that of the camera. Here's one of Octavius Hill. Of course, Octavius Hill was also a painter, as were many of the early photographers. They were both painters and photographers. And so this is a painting in the Scottish National Gallery, using an idea of how Octavius Hill used photographic tonality and possibly even photographs to create this painting, The Firth of Forth. So that where there is this close link between photography and photographers and artists during this period. And it's not always all spoken about. It is sometimes by some was seen as cheating. But one person who really developed photography in its own right in the Victorian period and made good use of the new scientific development of lenses was Julia Margaret Cameron. And she photographed many of the great and the good, particularly artists and poets and luminaries of the Victorian period in her inimitable photographs. And this one is from the museum in the Isle of Wight at Dimbola, which is where she worked from, quite close to where Alfred Lord Tennyson lived. And here is her studio at the Isle of Wight in Dimbola. And here we have her photograph of Charles Darwin, depicted 8 years after his publication of The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. And there we can see in the bottom right-hand photograph many famous Victorian figures, all photographed by Julia Margaret Cameron. And she would be worthy of a talk herself, actually, because such is the quality of her photographs, and also the slight out of focus look or spreading of the image or the movement really may have influenced some of G.F. Watts's later paintings as well. And she was a good friend of G.F. Watts, as we know. This is Robert Scott Tate, and now he was an interesting photographer and painter. He was a friend, he lived in Chelsea, and he was a friend of the Carlyle family and Thomas and Jane Carlyle. And I took this photograph in Thomas Carlyle's house in Chelsea, and there is Tate's painting above a dresser there. And then I took a photograph, my own photograph on the right, of the drawing room at Thomas Carlyle's house, and quite clear. And it's exactly, you know, you can see how it was totally reliant on photography. The painting was reliant on photography, and makes a number of obvious errors in many ways as a painting, because you get distortion of objects and towards the sides because of the lens. So that's a Robert Scott Tate's photograph. These are the left one is an example of his painting of Thomas Carlyle, where he probably did not use a photograph for that, but later on he went completely into photography, and certainly his paintings are far too reliant upon photographs to be interesting artistically. And you can see how the carpet almost becomes almost distorted, like one of those fairground mirror type images that you might see. But anyway, it was very interesting to see the two, and to actually walk in Thomas Carlyle's house, and to see how he was interested in photography himself, and he was both painted and photographed by many artists and photographers throughout his life. And they have some very good examples within his house in Chelsea, which is owned by the National Trust. And artists made good use of photographers, whether or not they directly copied, but they certainly used them almost as a help or as an aid. And my particular area of study, as you know, is John Everett Millet's work. And there's no doubt about it that his later landscapes, he made a great use of his looking at photographs, and the photographic tonality of many of his later landscapes would indicate that he was highly influenced by his friend Rupert Potter, the father of Beatrix Potter, with whom he spent a great deal of time in Scotland with at Dalgeese by the River Tay in Perthshire. And there's an example of a Rupert Potter photograph of woodland in Perthshire, and then a black and white photograph of Millet's dew-drenched firs in the middle. And then it's similar to some of the aesthetics that you get in Peter Emerson's photographs of this period, the Norfolk Broads. And we can certainly see that the photographic aesthetic was fed into the way artists of a more traditional nature painted on canvas. But there was also another aspect to photography, and how it definitely had this enormous influence upon artists. Of course, people since time immemorial have been fascinated by how animals move, particularly horses, and until the advent of photography, it was not fully understood how horse would gallop or canter, and how the feet went. And of course, there were many paintings. If you look at paintings before about 1850, you can see particularly paintings by Géricault, who enjoyed horse racing and painting races. You can see the gait of his horses is completely wrong. Whereas by the time of Muybridge's movement and animal locomotion captured in these photographs here, that artists immediately seized upon this, and particularly someone like Lady Butler in her Scotland Forever, you can see that such a painting would not be possible without photography. And not that weakens its impact. Of course, it actually strengthens it in some ways, but certainly the artists became using Muybridge's movement of animals and animal locomotion was very, very important to them, and continued to be so. And of course, this fed into the modern movement in painting at a later stage. But that's not to decry people like Landseer or George Stubbs from previous generations who had dissected and had done drawings of equine anatomy as well. So it was an ongoing parallel process, and of course a scientific investigation as such. As I've mentioned this book, I really would recommend this book here. And of course, on the cover is John Brett's famous painting of a glacier, which was inspired by Ruskin, who particularly took the Welsh artist John Brett under his wing. And he was very, very concerned about the strata of rock, and particularly gneiss rock. And I've done a little photograph there of gneiss rock from Scotland, which so obsessed John Ruskin and his friend Sir Henry Ackland, and as they set up the museum here in Oxford. And this is Ruskin, of course, wanted above all wanted artists to respect nature, to almost scientifically investigate nature, but because they saw it as a handy, as Ruskin, as at this stage as an evangelical, saw nature as the handiwork of God, and therefore its study was almost a theological study as well as an artistic study. Ruskin said, if you can paint a single leaf, you can paint the world. And he proved this in his own work. He was no slouch when it came to painting. Look at this wonderful study of a piece of brick with some moss on it. I mean, things like this are highly scientific. They're not necessarily very artistic, but they go back to the idea, rather like Albrecht Dürer, that in the Northern Renaissance, studying this great piece of turf from 1503, gives the idea that artists are to engage with the natural world and to, rather like the natural philosophers of Albrecht Dürer's time, should study each leaf, should study how things grow and to learn. And of course, this was the watchword of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood too. Go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth. Of course, there are many truths to be brought out in painting, and so the Ruskin truth was, of course, this very highly observed, almost microscopic view of the world in many cases. But he was able to reconcile that with his great love of the paintings of Turner as well, and the great atmospheric paintings of Turner. And of course, what better to illustrate Ruskin's philosophy than this particular portrait, which is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, John Ruskin, Glenfinlas. Quite apart from the interesting background to this, I photographed the actual spot at Brig o Turk in Perthshire, near Callander in Perthshire, the same waterfall, and you can stand on the same rock that Ruskin stood. And as you could see, the artist John Everett Millais, under Ruskin's tutelage, spent many months painting the background, painting no more than the size of a florin a day, to create really a unique portrait. It's almost as if it's about Ruskin and nature, of course, and each are being portrayed with equal veracity. There is not the sort of Joshua Reynolds hierarchy of importance within the canvas here. Even a bubble in the stream is as important as painting Ruskin's fingernails or his whiskers. This is Pre-Raphaelite art par excellence, and it's a brilliant piece of painting. And of course, we've talked much about the circumstances behind it and the collapse of Ruskin's marriage, but this painting itself is testament to this new vision and the marriage of science and art. And of course, it was at this time that Ruskin was deliberating about this great museum that was to be built as a sort of temple to science in Oxford, the Museum of Natural History. And at the trip at Brig o Turk, there were designs for windows, for niches within the museum. It was to be this perfect marriage between art and a study of nature. And of course, the original designs for the Oxford University Museum were classical, much more akin to the Ashmolean Museum, Cockerell's design. No, but Ruskin and Ackland decided it would be the Gothic, which eventually won the competition. And the Gothic, of course, could accommodate a lot of the variations and asymmetries that a classical building could not. And therefore, we have some of the most perfect pieces of art. And the O'Sheas, the Irish stonemasons who worked on some of the windows and the capitals, were ideally suited to this work, and it is a marvelous work. We know Benjamin Woodward's design, which was essentially built in the style of a medieval town hall, became so much more, and of course with its wrought iron interior and its glass roof made it a very modern building, and it is still a masterpiece of Victorian architecture. As you can see here, each capital demonstrates Pre-Raphaelite principles, and each one has a different leaf, and each column is made of a different polish of a different rock from all over Ireland. And the O'Sheas were brilliant in their capturing of the Ruskin Ruskin's principles here. And at the same time, an artist from Yorkshire, John William Inchbold, was painting such a painting as Early Spring, which again is almost photographic, but it shows this intense engagement with nature. And that again, a peculiarly sharp piece of painting, painted with tiny little sable brushes, but it is absolutely typical of this period. And whilst it looks photographic, it is almost that the artist is setting himself up, the human eye against the mechanical eye of the photographic as well at the stage. So it's not like Tate's photograph of the Carlyles, where photography has gone wrong. It's almost like Inchbold is egged on to paint something that is even more sharp than a photograph, as was Rosa Brett, John Brett's wife. And these are typical of this new fascination with them, with the minutiae of nature. And this is something that becomes very apparent in the late 1850s, just at the time as the museum opened. And these are excellent examples of Rosa Brett's work. And of course, we have it a little bit later, but no less sophisticated an artist, but is Beatrix Potter. And before she became very well known for her books on Peter Rabbit and The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin and others, she was really cut her teeth on painting fungi, and in fact was very well respected in her pursuit, and acute in her observations of nature, which stood her in good stead for really the work that she was later to be known for. But her observations of nature are excellent. I took this photograph in the Beatrix Potter Museum in Burnham for her paint box here, and she it was her uncle, who was Sir Henry Enfield Roscoe, who was a professor of chemistry, and she was unfortunately, the Linnean Society in London at the time did not accept her paper, which purely because of her sex. And unfortunately, rather like the Royal Society, it was these societies were very male dominated, and did not necessarily accept the work of women at this time. But it's later been acknowledged that her work was certainly groundbreaking, and some of her scientific observations were very accurate and well worth considering. This photograph on the right is from the buildings at Burlington House, which incidentally is where the current Royal Academy is. So there's always been this sort of link between scientists and artists. And the other, at this time, of course, Ruskin was fascinated with these great forces that work upon the earth, and geology. And of course, anybody who's been to the Guild of St. George will have seen Ruskin's famous collection of rocks and different types of rock, which he made intense study of. And of course, it was this period that he was very concerned by the new discoveries in geology, and also the emerging fossils that were becoming, which caused him to question the age of the Earth, and whether the Earth was in fact far older than had been presupposed. And so the action of glaciers was something that Ruskin had talked about in Modern Painters. And this particular painting by Brett is, of course, one of these, rather like the Glenfinglas Millet painting, is very much about rocks and the age of the earth, and the slow but inexorable changes that are wrought by glaciers. And of course, artists have since time immemorial painted glaciers and mountain glaciers, but there was gradually more and more understanding about glaciation, particularly alpine glaciation, and Ruskin spent a great deal of time in the Alps, as we know. And one of his at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, a divine, Richard Tyrwhitt, who was the minister at St Mary Magdalene Church in Oxford, was also an artist. And this painting here of the Mer de Glace, painted in 1859, the same year as the great debate as Origin of Species, and a year before the debate at the Oxford University Museum. This was under Ruskin's guidance. He painted this wonderful painting, again about glaciation. It's in the director's office in the museum, and so it's not open to the public. But here's my photograph of it. And it's a wonderful painting. It was also, of course, much he was much considered. He wanted paintings. Ruskin wanted paintings that also talked about the action of volcanoes as well, and certainly eruptions as well were in concern to him. And Ruskin drew this piece of gneiss rock just by Millet's waterfall at Glenfinglas, same time as he's having his portrait done. And as you can see, Ruskin too gives Millet a run for his money in this monochrome drawing, which is also at the Ashmolean Museum. But it wasn't unusual for artists in this period to have these marvelous collections of rocks and stones and minerals. And this is Thomas Cole, who obviously made his name in the USA as an artist. And this is his collection of box of minerals. And likewise, artists in the USA and the Philadelphia Academy and the East Coast Academies in America were interested in collecting rocks. And this is one very good collection that gives you an idea of the different types of minerals that are evident in some of his paintings. And this is the director's office in the University Museum of Natural History. And sorry about the boxes piled in front. They don't seem to treat these things with the respect they deserve, because these are behind the scenes, and yet this decorates the whole wall of the director's office in the museum. And it isn't painted in quite the style. It's a fresco, so it's actually painted into wet plaster, and it's really very interesting in many ways, and it is much looser. Although it is pre-Raphaelite in its sort of sense, it has a looser approach because being fresco, and again it illustrates the action of glaciation. And of course, we should remember, even prior to the museum opening, it was William Buckland who gave these wonderful lectures on natural philosophy. And there's a little print there of William Buckland giving one of his lectures. And they, again, rather like the Royal Society lectures, they were full of diagrams and were very entertaining as well, apparently, by all accounts. And certainly some of the fossils that he had uncovered, even in Oxfordshire, were extremely fascinating, particularly the Cumnor dinosaur. Here we are, as Turner again. This is it's Turner's own sea of ice, the Chamonix Valley, and from 1803, and then we see these other photographs of glaciation, which again obsessed Victorian photographers and painters. And this is again a detail from Tyrwhitt's fresco from 1859. And I took a series of photographs of these because they really aren't seen, and they're fascinating. Rather like in the Oxford Union, but the frescoes have been painted there, but they've decayed badly, whereas Tyrwhitt's frescoes have not, and they're still in a good state. And the other painting that is in the director's office is also on Vesuvius, which shows the volcanology. And of course, that has also interested artists throughout the ages. And remember back a century before, Joseph Wright painting the eruption of Vesuvius, and many artists went on the grand tour and were treated in a way to the eruptions of Vesuvius, and many paintings have been painted from that as well. So it interested obviously people like Ruskin that these things were depicted, and these are the great forces that work upon the planet that we are on. and the beginning of the understanding of geology and the new scientific understanding of the Earth. But there were certainly counteracting forces during this period. People were there was a great obsession with the great biblical flood of Genesis, and many adopted a counter. It wasn't really a theory, but it was catastrophism, which was held by many Victorians to be that the Earth was much younger, and maybe not as young as the 7,000 years that some commentators to the scriptures had said, but they'd said that the Earth was much younger, and as evidenced by places like the Grand Canyon, the depositions were much faster than the millions of years suggested by some of the geologists. And so there was a lot of interest in in paintings about the flood, Noah's flood, at this time. Not only because it affords a great subject matter for artists. We can think of Maclise's Noah's Sacrifice. We think of Danby. We think of John Martin and other artists who depicted great cataclysms and apocalypse upon the world. And indeed, you've even got intimations of that in Thomas Moran's late 19th century painting of the Grand Canyon. And Moran, of course, was a disciple of Ruskin, albeit from afar, but he went out west in the USA and painted at Yellowstone and obviously in Arizona and Utah, and came up with paintings like this. And so there was also this debate as well about the age of the Earth. Also, you see the rainbow from Noah's flood, but that comes into a number of pre-Raphaelite paintings. The divine promise, the promise of God after the flood, comes into a number of pre-Raphaelite paintings. And whilst the more scientific of the community view it entirely as in scientific terms, in terms of optics and the interaction of light upon water vapor and sunshine. For many a pre-Raphaelite artist, it also indicated divine benevolence. And so there was artists like Alfred William Hunt in his Rainbow of 1866, or you can think of Millet's The Blind Girl. I've done a little detail of it there with the quote from Genesis, or Maclise's The Sacrifice of Noah, or The Rainbow by William Davis, or indeed the little painting by Ford Madox Brown, who was always obsessed with scientific ideas and drawing from nature, as we'll see in a couple more of my slides, of Walton on the Naze and the rainbow. So the rainbow comes into a lot of Victorian painting for various reasons. And indeed, an artist like William Dyce also, this painting, apart from anything else, has two great natural phenomena within it. In the middle sky is Halley's Comet. You can just make it out as a little white line in the sky. And the women beneath the cliffs at Pegwell Bay are searching for fossils. And of course, it wouldn't be a good lecture if I didn't mention Mary Anning, the first fossil hunter from Lyme Regis, who brought this paintings in the Natural History Museum in London, who collected many and unearthed many great fossils around the Jurassic coast in Britain. And again, paintings like Pegwell Bay bring about, although Dyce was a deeply religious man, it also brings about some of the ideas about the age of the Earth and what fossils would say about it, whether they were indications of a great flood or whether indeed they were ages millions of years old, and therefore a different narrative comes forward. And of course, this brings John Ruskin to a crisis point in his own evangelical faith at one stage. And he would write to his friend Sir Henry Ackland a number of times on these matters, and there's a little quote there. Again, there was a lot. There was also open doubt which came about as a result of much of this scientific speculation and new scientific view of the age of the Earth, and indeed about the human life and study. And this is Alexander Bowler's painting, The Doubt, Can These Dry Bones Live?, which is painted in a pre-Raphaelite style. And of course, it leaves one with the question, which of course science can't answer, but it's they're working on parallel track in many ways. Although the artists are trying, in a way, to suggest things scientific, look at things scientifically as well. And then there's other considerations which change in the mid to late 19th century. The whole idea of this anthropomorphism, which is a big subject in painting and had been since the Renaissance, really, monkey and man. But of course, this becomes more and more pronounced following Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species by natural selection. And therefore, we get various paintings of chimera in Victorian art, particularly this one, The Minotaur, in 1885 by G.F. Watts, who I've given a talk upon. Again, it looks at the idea of man and beast. Again, Edwin Landseer, in his early work, in his Monkeyanna of 1828, it's rather amusing. But of course, as the century moves on, the relationship between monkey and man becomes far more prescient upon the Victorian imagination. And again, in the Great Exhibition, we have Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins' sculptures of which are reconstructions, early ideas about dinosaurs. And these dinosaurs are in the park in Sydenham, which were moved to Crystal Palace. When the Crystal Palace was removed from Hyde Park. And it was there for many years until it burnt down in the, I think it was the 1940s, it actually burnt down. But the Crystal Palace had included these sculptures of dinosaurs. And there we can see some nice illustrations from 1854 of these early constructions of dinosaurs, which of course were highly influential upon a lot of Victorian artists, not least Edward Burne-Jones in his Perseus Slaying the Sea Serpent. Or we look at Frederick Leighton's well-known Athlete and a Python. And then we look at Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins' studio in Central Park, the reconstruction of various dinosaurs. And in the USA, Elihu Vader's The Lair of the Sea Serpent. All of these things came about as a result of the beginning of fascination with sea monsters and indeed dinosaurs as such. And we can see these in some of Alfred Waterhouse, the architect's, designs for tiles of fossilized fish, which occur in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington from 1862. And also the terracotta gargoyles, which also employ sort of chimeric animals as well. And the enormous influence of science and new discoveries upon the artistic decorations of buildings can be seen here. And of course, in the paintings. And last week I was in Liverpool and I saw this wonderful painting by Frederick Lord Leighton of Perseus and Andromeda, of course, depicting the great story. But if you look at the dragon behind it, this is, of course, one of the based on skeletons from the natural history and fossils from the Natural History Museum. And we look at Evelyn de Morgan's SOS a little bit later. Again, it rather like the Waterhouse. It marries together these scientific speculations and dinosaurs and art are brought together in these Victorian paintings. Even Dante Gabriel Rossetti, you notice the dragon, St. George who slayed the dragon to win the Fair Maiden. We notice the dragon's head in the corner. And of course, this is 1857, so just coming slightly before Darwin's publication. And here he is himself. This is John Collier's portrait of Charles Darwin, a little bit, 20 years or so on from his publication. But of course, his his there's the HMS Beagle, the ship that he took to the Galapagos, and which he formulated much of his theory. And of course, the big questions about human origin, which are covered in different ways in art, of course, and that's worthy of a lot of our study too. But how this presentation of this particular paper at the museum at the 30th of June in 1860, of course, many of much of the dialogue was later, shall we say, cleaned up, and we don't really know some of the clever arguments whether minutes were fully taken. But it wasn't Darwin who argued with the Bishop of Oxford, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at the time. It was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, who argued in a debate. And the room itself can be visited in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. I've just taken a little photograph of the notice by the door of the room. At first I had the idea that it took place in the central court of the museum. It didn't. It was in a much smaller room and a much more intimate space. And that's a portrait. Unfortunately, we've got a bit of glare on our Bishop Wilberforce's portrait. I took that at Cuddesdon College near Oxford. And of course, the Victorian era is one of, if anything else, was one of collecting. And I mean, I can think of my great grandmother having one of these glass domes with various stuffed animals in it. And of course, this is what the subject of this painting is. But it's also about understanding the differences of species and taxonomy. And this is Millet's *The Ruling Passion*, or *The Ornithologist* from 1885. And rather like Henry Stacey Marks' *Science's Measurement* from 1879, both exhibited at the Royal Academy, and both take this Victorian obsession with naming everything within nature and coming to an understanding of it, and of course collecting it, rather like the fossils and rather like the rock cabinets. You would collect exotic birds as well. And of course, we're very much against this sort of thing nowadays, but in the Victorian period, it was seen as absolutely important to collect as much as and to have these huge collections of exotic birds for the beautiful plumage, but also for a bigger scientific understanding of the array of nature throughout the earth. And it was science that brought about some of the great engineering feats of the late Victorian era, particularly the Great Forth Bridge in 1890. There's a good example of that, a very, very highly modern bridge, really, when one considers it. And we think of the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 as well. But these things, in Poynter's painting, it's almost as if Poynter's painting Israel in Egypt, which is, of course, a biblically historical painting, is also, in a way, allied with the idea that we have engaged in these enormous engineering projects, much as ancient Egypt's construction of the pyramids. We, as an empirical nation, are building these new canals and these massive bridges and buildings and railways. And so Benjamin Leader, who's better known for some of his more pastoral scenes, also painted the construction of the Manchester Ship Canal, and which is again, it gives you a great example of engineering in the Victorian period. And Cremorne Gardens, I've often talked about this painting, about Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold and a falling rocket. Very abstract painting when you consider its date in 1874. But quite apart from that, the fireworks in the background, and in fact hot air ballooning as well, took place from Cremorne Gardens. And the obsession with ballooning in the Victorian era is again one that was eventually led to new views of the world. And we think of some of the great photographers who went up in balloons and giving new views on the city, and also aeronautics as well. And this slightly out of the scope of this particular talk, but certainly the paintings are reveling in these new ideas. And you go to Manchester Town Hall and you can see several paintings, late paintings by Ford Madox Brown, the pre-Raphaelite influence artist, And this is Dalton collecting marsh fire gas from 1879. And this is a remarkable piece of painting, fresco in Manchester Town Hall. And again, it celebrates some of the figures around in Lancashire and Manchester who contributed to the life of the city and to the science of the period. And there we are. And then looking back to Crabtree, watching the transit of Venus. And he looks at that, and as in the light of the new discoveries in astronomy and the widening of our understanding of the universe, and further with better lenses and better telescopes, we were gradually getting a better understanding about the Earth's position as well, and close and star systems, which were beginning to be observed by the end of the 19th century. And the Alexander Observatory at Aldershot was pretty close to where this man had his summer studio in Compton, and this is G.F. Watts. And just at the very end of his life, G.F. Watts painted this very abstract painting called The Sower of the Systems, which not only reflected some of his ideas about the origin of the universe, but also his interest in astronomy and in the passage of light across the heavens. And so we see an interesting interaction between artists and scientists here in this particular painting. And then we think of engineers who relied on the new scientific knowledge about disease, the spread of disease, and also how it could be alleviated, particularly within London. And Joseph Bazalgette's cross-nest engines at the Victorian sewage system, which is a wonderful temple to Victorian engineering. And also, we're very thankful for that today, that it actually cleared up this horrible Thames, which was just absolutely polluted and suffocating fumes and effluent. And there's James Tissot's painting on the Thames from 1876. And we thank Bazalgette that gradually, through scientific advances, that things were cleared to some extent. And then the first painting to be painted under electric light, 1879, Cherry Ripe by John Everett Millais, a famous painting. Not only that, but there was also the processes of actually doing colour prints from artists' paintings also was developing at this time, and I might talk about that at some point. And then in the theatre too, artists could once again depict the footlights in the theatre as a result of electric lamps. And within theatres, a lot of our view of the theatre changed in many ways. And this is Sickert's painting of at the Hungerford Palace of Varieties. And so this is why we get many more theatre paintings in the late Victorian era, and particularly in Camden Town. And this is one of Sickert's famous paintings. Alexander Graham Bell. There's an illustration of Victoria listening upon the Alexander Graham Bell's device at Osborne House in 1878. And gradually artists and illustrators were engaging with this new technology. And it looks like a giant, she's looking at a sort of giant iPad or something, but you could see it infiltrate almost all parts of art by the late part of the 19th century. And the great lions designed by Landseer at the foot of Nelson's Column, there were no foundries that could have done this until the 1860s. And Carlo Marichetti's studio was one of the best foundries, and it was through new techniques that we were able to cast such enormous sculptures, and we have them, and they were to be placed all around the empire as a result. And so that there was the civic sculptures took on a new life, really, with the ability to cast much larger on a much larger scale than before. And we look at Henry Young's and Company's foundry from 1881, and you can think of the bronze sphinxes at Cleopatra's Needle are similar. But all of these bear witness to this new scientific uh, uh, and engineering explorations that were developing in Victorian England. And of course there was the exploration of the world, the wider world, and the looking for different trade routes, and the Northwest Passage was one particular goal of some, and also the difficulties in traversing the Arctic Ocean. We think of Landseer's painting, "Man proposes, God disposes." We were still up against nature. There was no doubt about that, as illustrated in John Collier's painting, "The Last Voyage of Henry Hudson," speculating on the fateful voyage from many years previously. And then we think of also the Franklin mission of 1845 as well. But by the mid 1870s, it was thought that a Northwest Passage could be discovered. And this painting by Millet at the Tate Gallery illustrates this aspect of Victorian life and navigation. And we look at this portrait by James Watney Wilson, we can see the portrait of John Hanning's Beek, who went right into the heart of Lake Tanganyika. And there we see his sextant and his scientific instruments, which he took with him so he could accurately plot where he was going. And of course, we think of the exploits of and exploration of Sir Richard Burton as well at this time. And it was a period of great exploration. And of course, we have the Geographical Society also in South Kensington as well, from where many a Victorian expedition set out from, and of which we are very grateful for some of their maps and their artifacts to this very day. And of course, medicine was another huge area which was developing. In 1837, at the start of Victoria's reign, life expectancy was in the high 30s, but by 1901, it had increased to 48 years old. This is a general populace, of course. Many of the upper classes, of course, were living well into their 60s and 70s by this stage. But for the general populace, it was still only 48 years old at the end of the century. And surgery, I don't think you would really want to be opened up necessarily in the 19th century, and yet with developments in anaesthetic and also with some of the surgical instruments. This is the great physician to the artists, particularly at the time, Sir Richard Quain. Here's some of his instruments. I hate to think, I think some of those are blood stains on this little thing, which is in the Royal College of Surgeons, also in South Kensington. And these are, he was a famous surgeon at the time. Of course, in the earlier part of the 19th century, and even right up until the 1890s in America, we had these open surgeries, which are almost like theatre. And this is Thomas Aiken's painting of the Agnew Clinic, which is rather like the Rembrandt painting of Dr. Tult's painting of a surgery, or indeed post-mortem in a way. So this was another area of great development, and it's reflected in a number of paintings of this period. And I'll be quick now. This is also a period of pseudoscience and speculation, and of course, like any period when you're making great scientific advances, there is also other questions come in, such as ghosts and seances and spirit photography, such as this photograph on the right. Obviously, you can see it's a sham now because it's just a double exposure. But to the Victorians of the period, they were fascinated with these things. And Millet's Speak of 1895 very much engages with that subject. And then there was John Henry Pepper's Ghost Illusions in the 1860s, and there's a little diagram about how one of them was projected, and these phantoms were projected into the theatre and were, at the time, without the modern technology, were very convincing to audiences. And then, of course, we have H.G. Wells and his time machine, and Jules Verne. It's the period of all these things, and artists were employed to illustrate some of these new speculations about under the world, under the sea, under journey to the center of the earth, time machines, and spaceships. All of those things were in the mind of the late Victorian, and indeed, in a way, it was these science fiction that led to the new century, and of course that is another story. And I'd like to thank the Museum of Oxford Natural History, Ashmolean Museum, National Gallery, Tate Britain, Science Museum, Laycock Abbey, and I'd like to thank Dimbola, Julia Margaret Cameron Trust, Kelvin Groder Art Gallery, the Hunterian Museum, and the Thomas Cole Natural Historic Site for the use of some of these slides tonight. And now